Hello, good morning. Robin Knowles here from Digital Leaders. My pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. I think this is going to be an insightful webinar, and it's really designed to explore how codes of practice, rule books, and other authoritative information can be unlocked to enable innovation and growth in the sector. We've got two speakers with us who are going to take us through this. We've got Richard South, he's CEO of TSO, the leading publishing partner for regulators. He's overseen many complex digital transformation projects for regulators and government where accuracy is critical, and he's joined by Alan Blanchard. Alan's been responsible for digital transformation both as a regulator and consultant, and in his current role at TSO helps organisations to publish regulations more effectively. So you, our audience, are muted with cameras turned off. You'll see on the bottom there's a chat function, and there's also a Q&A function. We will hopefully have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So do put your questions in there as they occur to you, and there'll be time to ask them at the end. But for now, I shall get out of the way and hand over to Richard and Alan. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Robin, and welcome to everybody this morning. Thank you for joining us for our talk. We're going to be talking about the essentials for innovation in digitising regulations and standards, and this is an area that's very close to TSO's heart. We've been helping our clients and working with our clients who are digitising regulations and standards for many years now, but developments in technology, particularly AI, and the increasing encouragement for regulators to enable for growth mean that there's huge potential to go further and more quickly in this area. So we hope to talk through some of those opportunities with you this morning. So we'll just have a look at our agenda to take you through what we'll be talking about. So we're going to start by looking at the challenge itself and talk a little bit more about what that challenge is, and then talk about reducing regulatory complexity by unlocking regulation and digitising regulatory content and the benefits of doing so. We'll also talk a little bit about what that actually means. And then we'll take you through an innovation pathway for regulators who are looking to digitise content and unlock regulation. Then we'll focus particularly on AI and how AI can power that transformation of regulatory content and also enable regulation and enable compliance with regulation more effectively. And a little bit about how to make that a more accurate process. And then hopefully we'll end with plenty of time for your questions, which we will endeavour to answer. So if we have a look at our first slide, this is an attempt to describe the challenge. Now, this is the challenge both from the point of view of regulators, but also organisations, companies and individuals who need to comply with regulation and need to understand regulation. And the challenge for both, well, the primary challenge here is just how many regulators there are and how much regulation there is to comply with. So we've been very much helped by the Institute of Regulation in preparing this slide. The Institute's a membership body which promotes good practice in regulation. And they've grouped the types of regulation, the types of regulators that are relevant just in the UK into these 7 groups in the centre, to which we've added sports regulation, which is another area that TSO is familiar with. So we see regulation of ethics, of public services, of professional of professional careers and professions, of businesses themselves, of specifically financial regulation and broader economic regulation, but we also see international regulation. So this is only an attempt to look at the complexity and the challenge of regulation in the UK, but businesses, organisations and people who are regulated and who operate in the UK also need to be aware of the international regulation that's relevant to them. So if you're an organisation setting up in the UK or a business entering a new market, you need to understand which of these regulators and which of this regulation is relevant to you and how to find that. And that's more difficult when that regulation is locked away in fixed formats. And that's where we're going to start our conversation this morning. If we can have a look at our next slide. So how do regulators reduce the burden of regulation on organizations they regulate, and reduce the burden of compliance, make it easier for organizations to comply while regulating for growth? Well, we can reduce regulation. Regulators and government can reduce regulation to reduce the operating costs that regulation creates for business, to reduce the barriers of entry to new businesses who need to understand regulation and comply with it before they can even start to operate. Reducing regulation can increase efficiency because it can remove the various stages of compliance checks through a business process, and it can streamline processes generally. It can also enhance innovation because in a regulatory environment, regulation can prevent innovation itself, because in innovating around new products and services, organizations and businesses need to be very aware of the limits even to them testing and trying new things. So reducing regulation can reduce all of those burdens. But we would say so can unlocking regulation. And we don't look at unlocking regulation as an alternative to reducing regulation, more of an also. By unlocking regulation, we would argue that you can achieve all of those 5 benefits in the left-hand column: the lower cost, the reduction of barriers to entry, efficiency, streamlining, and easier innovation. We can also make regulation easier to find by people and organizations who are regulated, easier to use, and easier to understand. It's also easier once regulation and regulatory content is unlocked to integrate that content into organizations' business processes. So you can create regulation as part of your operating model, part of your business process. You can build that regulatory guidance in to make it inherent in everything that you do. Also, unlocking regulation can be an alternative to removing regulation, where removing that regulation would create a specific risk of harm, the kind of harm that the regulation was intended to prevent in the first place. So in some instances, it may be an alternative to reducing regulation, as well as an additional way to reduce the burden of regulation and the burden of complying with regulation. So let's have a look at the benefits of unlocking regulation. So we split this into 2 slides because we really think we need to look at both the benefit for regulators and also the benefit for regulated organizations and people. So Alan's going to join me a little bit in talking about these slides, but for regulators, unlocking regulation, we believe, can give a regulator more control over how they update that regulation. Alan, can you tell us a little bit about how unlocking regulation gives regulators more control over updates?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Richard, and hi, everyone. So here we need to think about regulatory content when it's unlocked as data. So it's no longer a Word file on a network drive somewhere. We can structure it as data, and we can treat it as data, so that when it comes to updating that content, that regulatory content, this can be done more quickly, and it can be done more accurately because you know exactly the pieces of content you want to change. And it enables you to put other tooling around there, like a content management system, for example, where this would then give you workflows and control over who accesses content and data, so that you can activate that control in a much more kind of user-centric way, let's say.
I'm guessing, Alan, that's also how regulation can be published, particularly if you're implementing a content management system or a publishing system over that unlocked data.
Yeah, so if you think about the data, it's the content as data, then when you want to distribute that content out somewhere, whether that's a website, into a mobile app, into some e-learning, whatever it is, there's no other step required in order to do a transformation piece on that data. The data can be used and ingested by whatever output system it is you want. Now, generally, this is a website, and the website will just draw from that content management system the data that it needs to populate its web page with the relevant content.
So if you've populated a content management system or a publishing system with unlocked data, and you change that data because the regulations changed, a regulator can make those changes more quickly, and then that will enable them to publish those changes, that new regulation, more quickly as well.
Exactly right. And then to sort of the third point there about the improvement in policy making as such, is that as a policymaker, and remember, a regulator will be comprised of many different aspects of policy. It won't just be one person looking after all the policy. It's generally a lot of people, and those people need to understand what happens if they want to make a change. So there's something that's happened in the market that needs a rule change, and how they assess that rule change can be improved. So you can understand much better what happens if I tweak this requirement, and what happens with that when I send it out into the market as well.
So one of the chief opportunities for improving policy making is understanding the impact of a change. When you make a change that needs to happen, having that data unlocked so that you can apply that change in a sort of a test environment allows you to see the impact of that change on other regulation.
Yes, and you're reducing the chances of unintended consequences, because sometimes you make a change to a rule and it changes something else which you weren't expecting. So you're reducing the risk of that happening as well.
So to our last point, we hear a lot now about enabling regulation for growth. A lot of the regulators that we work with at TSO see their primary role, I apologize, as being to enable growth, to enable in the markets and the areas that they regulate. One of those ways that they can have that impact is by encouraging new entrants to join existing markets. How does unlocked regulation make that easier?
Yes, regulators definitely want new entrants to their market. They want to encourage competition. They want better outcomes for consumers within that market, and that happens when you have more innovation in that market as well. But if you've put a regulatory barrier in that's too high, as you discussed a couple of slides ago, it's much difficult for new end market participants to join that market, because they need to do an awful lot in advance of joining that market to be able to make sure that they're joining in a compliant way. Whereas if you've made it much more of a data exercise, and I can say I want to join this market as this particular type of business, then show me the rules that apply to me. You can do that much more accurately, and therefore give the new business there a fighting chance of understanding what they need to do to enter that market in a compliant way.
So unlocking regulation can make it easier for new entrants to join a market, encouraging competition and growth for regulators who are regulating for growth.
Exactly.
Let's have a look at it from the point of view of the regulated organizations there. What are the benefits to organizations, which could be businesses, could be charities, could be other organizations, but frequently also people? What are the benefits of unlocking regulation to them? Now, we talk about regulation being more accurate and up to date. I guess up to date is critical, because if you're a regulated organization, you want to know that you're following the latest interpretation of regulation, the latest version of the rules. How does unlocking data help to achieve that?
You can put in there much more let's say user-centric, end-user-centric tooling and features and functionality that allow the user to obtain that information much more easily. So not only do they potentially receive an alert when something has changed that they're interested in, they've flagged an interest in a particular rule, it's changed, you get an alert. You can also have the sort of summary of that sent to you as well, and you can understand much more easily how that's going to impact your business itself. So you can understand what I need to do differently in terms of the business that I'm doing as a result of the rules being changed.
One of the things actually we've found frequently is when you're unlocking regulation, when you're unlocking regulatory content, turning that into data, you'll identify legacy errors, things that had been wrong for a long time in those locked up formats like PDF and print. And so the process of transforming to data, of unlocking that regulation in itself, can make the existing regulation more up to date and more accurate, even without making any future changes to it. But what about interaction with other systems? So this is machine readability, I'm guessing interoperability. How does unlocking data and regulatory content enable that?
Yeah, let's take obligations extraction as an example to work with here. So at the moment, when I need to understand the obligations that a particular rule is giving me, I, at the moment, go and read the rule, wherever that is, and then put that into a spreadsheet and sort of assess how much I need to do in order to comply with that. And then you manually transpose those into your policies and controls. Now, what we mean here by interoperability, and when you have data, is that your business systems, your business processes will be able to receive those changes and extract those obligations as data and feed them in without having that human step in the middle of the manual process of taking those obligations out, putting them in a spreadsheet and turning them into something else. We can start having those systems connect to each other so that the rules data can be fed through to the policies and control systems, the business process systems, and those guardrails can be adjusted depending on what those rules say. Now we start to see much more of a sort of digital first, let's say, machine to machine sort of conversations happening with less human interaction required, particularly for obligations where you're very comfortable with not having much human oversight or interaction. That could be reporting requirements, for example, things like this. But where you need more human interaction, you can, of course, stop the process, have a manual verification check in there before you continue with the automation.
But essentially, turning rules and regulation into data and into code means that regulation, those rules can interact with systems that organizations have built or that they use, which keep them aware of the latest rules, the latest regulation from all of the regulation and regulators that they need to comply with. So that's a system level thing which can't happen while regulation is locked up in traditional formats. At the same time, we're making regulation and rules easier to find.
We are, most definitely. So when you structure your data, you can add other data to that data. So you can add metadata to it, which describes what that data is. And particularly in a regulatory context, what we're saying is what's the topic or the scope of this regulation, so that you can, as a user of that information, say, show me all the rules that apply to me as this particular type of business or this particular type of organization. And that metadata markup of the structured data will be able to return those results to you much more accurately. So you don't have to go into the site, dig around, follow links, and try and understand what's going on. Am I even looking at the most up-to-date version of this rule? You can put your search in much more as a user would expect to interact with information. Here's my search, give me my results, and everyone is happy with the kind of quality of the results that come back.
So that same process of adding metadata, enriching regulatory data that helps systems to understand data and helps regulation to be easier to find, can promote the understanding of what that regulation actually means and how to comply with it.
Exactly, that's right. So you can add contextual data to that source data if you want to as well. You can feed that data through into other learning systems, if you like. So you can say, look, you're interested in these rules over here. There are some other rules that might apply to you over here. You've got that context alignment much more proactively. Or you can also attach other sort of less rule-based documents to that, like there's an e-learning module you might need, or we've published some guidance on this, or there's a different type of report that we've done. And you can map all of those together and serve them up to the user at the point in time that they need them, rather than having them stashed away on a sort of quiet part of the website, which no one ever visits.
But fundamentally, you can improve understanding of the rules and the regulation itself just by enriching that,
Exactly.
that content.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's have a look at what unlocking regulation and unlocking data actually means. So traditionally, regulation and rules have been published in PDFs and other closed formats, evolved from the days when all of those rules were essentially printed and made available in print. It's more difficult to track changes in that kind of format. It's difficult for users to see changes, and to make changes, the whole PDF or the whole document needs to be updated. It's also difficult to show any kind of timeline of how regulation has changed from one day to another, from one year, month, and week to another. But also, web searches may only return partial results, because if you search for a particular topic of regulation, you might just find a PDF, you might not find the correct PDF or the correct documents, and you may also be returned things that are no longer in date that still match the search criteria. And then, of course, in the content itself, it's more difficult to search the regulation itself once you've found that document, because you've only got the limited search tools that are available in print. You have indexes and so on, but also in PDF and similar formats. So by unlocking that data, we typically mean taking that data, taking the content that's in those traditional formats, those closed formats, and lifting it out into formats like XML and JSON, standard structured data formats, which, as you described against our last slide, Alan, you can then enrich with metadata that brings more meaning to that content. And with structured data, data schemas can determine the structure itself and how that structure is applied to the content that's reflected in the data. Taxonomies can provide classification of that content, so that can help the process of adding metadata. And ontologies can map the relationships between the rules that are reflected within that data and other rules and their application, and help to inform those data structures. So all of these things can be going on in creating structured data that was previously locked up in fixed formats. And as we've talked about when we've been talking about the benefits, that actually has the advantage of making those rules, those regulations, readable by machines, by systems and services, as well as just by humans. So let's move on and have a look at an innovation journey for regulators. Alan, would you like to just walk us through this? How regulators, depending on where you are now as a regulator and where you feel your regulation and content is, how you can move through to a place where you can have converted that content into data, you can have unlocked that content and be benefiting from AI in both powering that transformation and enabling regulated users to access that content.
Yeah, exactly. So here I've sort of put together this model to kind of, as you say, map where regulators are in this journey, and we've got the sort of typical production of regulatory content activities on the left-hand side there, from rule drafting all the way through to putting that out in the wide world. And then if you move from left to right, we sort of have the first two columns as your unstructured data environment, so where we have everything locked up in PDFs, and we have Excel very much as part of the process, and manual work both on the regulator side and on the organizations that consume that content side as well. And then as we get into the third column there, we start to introduce some of these more kind of digital approaches. So we have the content management system. We've started marking up our content with a taxonomy, and our organizations and users can now start turning that content into rule sets for their own kind of adoption. And then the sort of fourth and fifth columns there, where we're really starting to leverage some of the AI tooling that we have available these days. We certainly didn't have it to this extent a few years ago. And the fourth column is how we can use AI to create that structured data for us. So can we use AI to mark up relevant content for us, to allow us to do semantic markup, for example, which is a very labor intensive job if you're doing that without the aid of AI. And then can we look at how AI allows us to understand those rules and start embedding them within the organization's policies and controls. And then on the fifth column there, we are now deploying AI in a much more kind of let's say independent way, and we're allowing the AI to help us with drafting, so we can understand the changes that we're going to make in real time. We can use digital twins to help figure out what happens if I tweak this requirement over here and remove this requirement over there. Does this create a loophole or something like that? We can identify that in real time. When you've published your final rules, you can notify your organizations much more automatically and provide them with a summary. So the AI could even do a small summary of the changes for you there without you having to produce too much kind of what would you say, ancillary information. And then we want to get really to the sort of bottom right hand corner there, which is the automatic adoption. So we have much more of a digital automation, AI underpinning everything between the regulator and the organization there.
So most importantly, Alan, in that fifth column, I should call it, people who are regulated, organizations who are regulated, can now use AI most effectively to understand, to access and understand AI. So regulators have gone to a level of enrichment and transformation into structured data that means the AI journey that many regulated organizations are following is now more effective and delivers more accurate results.
Yes, it's about understanding what your users, your organizations actually want. Do they want to go and trawl PDFs, spend, half a day trying to find the answer to their question, trawling through PDFs, or do they want to be able to set their business up in a way that their policies, controls, whatever sort of guardrails they've got in place are fed in a much more automatic way, so that they're compliant by design. They're not having to worry too much about whether they're up to date and accurate. It's about saying, I'm very happy complying with the guardrails that you put in place, and my business is set up to make sure that we adopt those automatically. So let's move on. So this is sort of a deeper dive into that fourth column there. So the how AI powers the transformation of regulatory content into structured data. And certainly when I was looking at this in a previous regulator I worked at about 10 years ago, I was desperate to have AI help me mark up the content so that we could do semantic markup much more quickly. But the AI tooling was not sufficiently developed at that time. I believe now it is, and we have a lot more choice in terms of the tooling that we use, so that we can put in an awful lot more regulatory content and understand that it will structure that data much more accurately than was previously possible, and therefore a lot faster. So it's not going to take a bunch of humans, many, many months to do this. It should take your AI tooling, I wouldn't say exactly, but days and weeks rather than months and years. So this is definitely a benefit of being at this point in time in terms of what AI tools are available to us. And then if we jump into kind of like the fifth column there and dig into that, this is about what the impact is for the users and the organizations themselves. And we touched on that just a few seconds ago about the better search experience. So, AI can underpin conversational queries. You can start doing sort of natural language approaches to these things. You don't have to understand the technical and content that's in there. It can be very specific terminology that the regulator uses, whereas you just want to say, show me what I need to be able to comply. And that's the question that you ask, and you get the correct results back. And then when we're talking about consumable data there, we're talking about that being used sort of machine to machine. So is there a context where that data informs what a machine is doing? So here we've used a driverless car as an example, but the driverless car can be consuming the rules of the road. It's a very simple example to say, I can determine, as the car can determine what it can or can't do by referencing and calling the rule book in to determine, should it stop at this junction? Can it ignore these rules, these signs? Can it go down this road, et cetera, et cetera? So we get more consumable data in that respect. And then when we're talking about synthesizing information there, that's about, if you remember the sort of slide of all the regulators that Richard showed at the beginning there, you don't usually have to, your query isn't always, your answer isn't always derived from a single regulator. More often than not, you need more than one source of regulatory content for this, and AI will allow you to synthesize an awful lot of information together. So where regulators overlap, where they might give contradictory answers, for example, you're able to identify these things so that you have more of a, give me all the rules applicable to a particular sector approach, rather than just me and my business. I want to see all the regulators that are in play, whether that's, it can be environmental and data, which you wouldn't necessarily pull together unless you're trying to build a spaceport somewhere, for example. So, and then this is sort of my last point. We're not just going to leave it all to the AI, though. AI is a tool for us as humans to use, and we know that we can't let AI loose because it will start doing things we don't want it to. But there are ways that we can make sure that it is doing what we want it to in the correct way. And if you kind of leave a large language model to its own devices, it will start hallucinating because it's very helpful. It wants to help you. It wants to provide an answer. Now, sometimes, particularly with technical content, regulatory content, it's not always helpful to provide an answer. So where we've got retrieval augmented generation, we are making sure that we have knowledge bases that will tell the AI whether or not to give an answer and whether it can or not, so that we don't give any wrong information. And then we can do training around, I would say the training and the fine tuning are very kind of aligned. I would use the term small language model for this. So it's where you've got your unique data set for that authoritative data or that specific specific types of queries that are going to go into that data, and you can train your language models very accurately on how to deal with those queries and what to understand when it's producing its answer. And then we always want the human in the loop for the development of AI processes. So where you have that automation, that level of AI automation across the top, we need to make sure that that is a human designed automation, not just a kind of purely machine to machine situation. And then finally, we need the guardrails for the inputs and outputs. It's kind of underpinning all of those points there, because we do not need unhelpful or harmful responses, particularly in the context of regulatory information. The margin for error must be, this big. It can't be too wide. We have to be sure that we are only going to get back the correct answers, really.
So thanks, Alan. I think I'm just going to summarize the key points of what we've talked about this morning. So hopefully covered quite a lot of ground. Really, the starting point for us is transforming regulatory content into structured data unlocks that regulation. So you can unlock your regulation to a wider audience, to make that regulation easier to understand and comply with by starting the process with turning that content into structured data. Now, unlocking regulation then reduces the burden of compliance. It can support the goals around regulation enabling industries and enabling growth, alongside a reduction in regulation, and in some cases as an alternative. But we've talked a lot about AI today as well, and I think to summarize our point about AI can both help the process of unlocking regulation, but it can also help regulated organizations and regulated companies comply with regulation. And these are two quite different things that AI is doing. Firstly, to help you as regulators to unlock your regulation, and secondly, to help those regulated audiences, those regulated organizations and markets find and understand and comply with the regulation. And then making regulatory data, because you've now unlocked that regulation, it's now data and code, making that regulatory data more consumable by AI can provide a better user experience for people who are going to be increasingly using AI tools to understand what the regulation is and how to comply with it. And of course, within that, and with regulation and the legal environment around regulation, accuracy is key. So further training and fine-tuning LLMs and other AI models is very, very important. And you can do that once you've begun that process of unlocking content and making more and more the regulation available as code and available as data. Human review will remain important, but AI will be able to do more and more in generating accurate, helpful, and meaningful responses for the organizations and people that you regulate. So we hope that's been an interesting conversation, an interesting run through. Hope those key points are useful takeaways. And I know we've now got 10 minutes to take some questions and answers. So over to you, and thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Alan. A great presentation. So we've got our Q&A box down there at the bottom, and if you can put your questions into there, that would be extremely helpful. You can also put them into the chat as well, and we'll pick them out of there as we go along. So the first question is, can you provide an example where this has happened and a successful implementation of this? Are they out there?
Well, there are lots of examples where regulation has been unlocked. I mean, probably the kind of leading, probably global example would have been the law itself. So legislation.gov.uk, which National Archives are responsible for, and we work with them on the publication of that site. That was a major project to turn legislation in the UK into data and to unlock legislation, which is the primary set of all the rules and regulation that we're talking about. So that would be a very good example. But there are other examples both in the UK and elsewhere in the world where regulators are publishing regulation as code, publishing regulation as data, and getting the benefits of interaction. Because when you do it, third parties will build and do build services around that. And we talk about regulated organizations using third parties to understand all the regulation that's relevant to them. Well, they do that sometimes by the regulated organization do it by going to a third party RegTech provider and taking a solution that pulls together regulation from multiple sources that are relevant. You can only do that if that regulation has been unlocked into data so that those systems can find that content in a machine readable way.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope that's answered your question, Louise. So I mean, AI is relatively new. I mean, it's relatively new in the conscience of leaders as something that their organization can tap into. For smaller organizations, and there is a general feeling it's not inexpensive to use or to use properly in your organization. But for smaller organizations with much more limited resources, is it possible, is this a space for them as well?
I think so, because you can start in a very small way. So a lot of organizations who are creating rules and regulation standards, even some of the public sector regulators are quite small, and certainly some of the standard setters beyond that are very small organizations. They will typically have a core rule set and then more rules and regulation interpretation around that. And so a good starting point can be to actually just take one core rule set and convert that content into data. We work with regulators and other organizations to help them do this very, very frequently. And organizations can do that themselves, or they can take third-party advice on doing it. So you can start small and then build out, depending on what your current volume of regulation and current volume of regulatory content is.
Okay, thank you. Philippa's got a question, which is a question for all public sector organizations, I think, and also private, so that's a little unfair on public sector, is kind of how can you upskill your team to be able to get involved in this sort of regulators innovation pathway that you were talking about? That's going to be a barrier for a lot of people, across the whole organization, is just having the skills to trust and believe that this is going to work.
Yeah, look, Alan may have some thoughts as well, but I mean, there are some basics here around training and education and being open to the right kind of thought leadership and background information that's going to be relevant from you. I mean, there's no alternative in some ways to just monitoring all available sources and to seeking out the kind of courses and personal development programs that can help you to understand more about AI and where AI is going, even if you're an organization that doesn't have a very large technical team. Lots of organizations now have their own e-learning platforms or allow their employees to use third-party e-learning platforms. And there's a huge amount of content around these areas there. They can also talk to organizations like TSO and others who are out there and partnering with regulators and standard setters in the market. There's an awful lot to read on this. The challenge is keeping up to date with the latest best practice and where AI is going, because almost by definition, it's accelerating at pace. But I think organizations, by encouraging their individuals to stay aware of what's happening and to engage with that kind of personal learning and development, can certainly help.
Yes, I would just come in on that and sort of covering Andy's point as well. So when I was at the regulator, was very keen on embarking on this pathway, and I partnered with regulatory technology firms. They had the in-house expertise already. They knew what they were doing when it came to JSONs and APIs, and I didn't necessarily. So I found expertise outside of the regulator. I think nowadays you're seeing more and more regulators with a small in-house team that will look after AI and data and things like this. But generally that doesn't have the sort of room for maneuver in terms of scaling either. So I would go out there, in addition to the training that you're doing, I would go out there and partner as well.
I mean, I'd be bound to say in answer to Andy's question, we are an example of one of those teams who do that. This is one one of the things we do with our clients, and we work with our clients to help them on that process. But there are lots of organizations who can help. There are different partners you can seek. And I think it's interesting that you talk about taxonomy and ontologies, but the actual jump from unstructured to structured feels big. But actually, as we've talked about today, creating the taxonomies and the ontologies helps to provide the pathway to that structured data from unstructured data. And there are a lot of tools, and as we talked about, AI-driven tools that can help with that transformation process now.
Brilliant, thank you. And I hope that's helpful, Andy. I've got a question here about hallucinations in the context of LLMs, and are there other concerns about copyright or other inappropriate use of content in LLMs?
So I think for me, the important thing here is what we were talking about in our kind of fifth column in that innovation pathway. By structuring data and providing that metadata that enriches that regulatory content to give it more meaning and to explain its provenance, explain its application, and so on, you make the accuracy of what AI finds greater. So copyright, of course, the challenge, but you're generally in regulation not talking about content that you copyright so much as that you want to ensure that it has the provenance and accuracy when it's read and interpreted. So structuring data as a regulator puts you in a much better position to control the narrative, to control the understanding that AI takes of regulation. Structuring it and enriching it, which you can only do once you've structured it. So that's why we talk about in the fifth column of that diagram, structuring data in order to deliver more accurate results for the organizations who need to understand and comply with regulation when they use AI-based tools to understand that and to find that regulation. So it's a complex chain, but we believe the whole process of structuring data is part of responding to that challenge about content being misinterpreted, about copyright, and about accuracy.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got a question here. What are the best practices for maintaining the security integrity of digitalized regulatory information? So what...
Alan, would you like to?
Yes, well, luckily we are in the cloud era, which is very well timed. So for me, I would be looking at cloud solutions to enable that. So it would be a case of designing your digital solution, your structured data. If you place that in the cloud, you necessarily have whatever cloud system you're using, putting in those security structures around that so that you aren't and this is particularly important when you're making those changes and delivering those updates, that you don't want the wrong information appearing at the wrong time, let's say. So there's a combination of kind of like your workflow practices combined with the technology stack that you're using. I would recommend cloud for that. Puts those barriers around that and ensures that you're not going to do anything that's too risky.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. I think we're out of time. We've had some great questions, so thank you very much indeed to the audience for giving us those. You can see contact information there for Alan and Richard up on the page. It just remains for me to thank Alan and Richard for a great presentation, really comprehensive. I think it's obvious that the audience has enjoyed it, which is great. And you've got them thinking hard about the topic, so we can ask for nothing more. So thanks to you both, and look forward to seeing you at the next talk.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning.